A single revolver just sold for enough money to buy an entire city block, and it didn't belong to a president or a king. It belonged to a 21-year-old outlaw who bled out in a dark bedroom in New Mexico in the summer of 1881. The Wild West ended more than a century ago, but the firearms carried by the men who lived and died by them have quietly become some of the most valuable objects in American history. 10 of them have now crossed or come close to 7 figures at public auction. These are 10 guns owned by the outlaws and lawmen who built the legend of the American frontier, and the numbers behind them will make you look at every old revolver in your family a little differently. Let's start the countdown. Number 10, Virgil Earp's Colt. Most people only know one Earp brother. History remembers Wyatt as the gunslinger of Tombstone, but it was actually Virgil, the older brother, who held the badge. Virgil served as city marshal of Tombstone, Arizona, and on October 26, 1881, he was the officer in charge during the 30-second shootout that the world would come to call the gunfight at the OK Corral. Wyatt and their brother Morgan were only deputized help that day. Virgil ran the operation, and it was Virgil who took the legal responsibility for every shot fired. 2 months after the gunfight, Virgil was ambushed in the street by hidden gunmen and left partially crippled for the rest of his life, his left arm permanently damaged by shotgun pellets. He survived that attack and lived on until 1905, working later as a deputy sheriff in California. His personal Colt revolver, verified through documented Earp family ownership, sold at J. Levine Auction in Scottsdale back in April of 2014 for $37,500, blowing past its $30,000 estimate. That sale was part of a larger Earp family memorabilia auction that brought in over $445,000 total, a signal that even the supporting cast of Tombstone carries real collector weight. Back in 1990, a documented Virgil Earp Colt would have struggled to clear $3,000. Today, any firearm with confirmed Earp family provenance is a 5- to 6-figure gun, and private sales on strong examples have pushed past $75,000. If you ever come across a revolver tied to the Earp name, the identifying thread is always the same: a documented chain of ownership through the family descendants, period photographs or letters placing the gun in Virgil's hands, and ideally a Colt factory archive letter confirming the production date lines up with his years wearing a badge in Tombstone. Number 9, Annie Oakley Stevens rifle. Before there was a Wild West, there was Phoebe Ann Moses, a girl from Darke County, Ohio, born in 1860, who was putting meat on her family's table with a rifle by the time she was a teenager, reportedly paying off her mother's mortgage with game money before she turned 16. By her mid-20s, she was the headline act of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, splitting playing cards edge-on from 30 paces and shooting a dime out of her own husband's fingers in front of a paying crowd. She toured Europe with the show and reportedly shot a cigarette from the hand of the future Kaiser of Germany during a European exhibition. Oakley went through dozens of firearms across her career: custom Parker shotguns, Smith & Wesson revolvers, Marlin lever guns, and single-shot Stevens rifles built to fit her smaller frame and shorter reach. Many were factory-engraved gifts from manufacturers hoping her name would sell their product to the public. Her personal Stevens rifle, backed by documentation from her stage performance records and in personal correspondence, sold at auction for $143,400. Other Oakley firearms with strong paper trails have brought anywhere from $100,000 to $400,000 depending on how deep the documentation goes, and pieces with her personal engravings still turn up occasionally at major Americana sales. And that's really the lesson with every gun on this list. Without provenance, it's just an old rifle. With it, it's a 6-figure piece of American history. Number 8, Wyatt Earp's Colt Single Action Army. Wyatt Earp is the name most people associate with the entire era, and for good reason. Born in Illinois in 1848, he worked as a buffalo hunter, a faro dealer, and a lawman across half a dozen frontier towns before settling into his brother Virgil's shadow as deputy in Tombstone. Before Arizona, Earp had already built a reputation as a deputy in Wichita and Dodge City, Kansas, 2 of the wildest cattle towns in the country during the height of the cattle drive era. He stood in the gunfight at the OK Corral on October 26, 1881, and he outlived every other man who was there, dying in Los Angeles in January of 1929 as the last surviving figure from that 30 seconds of gunfire, having spent his final decades as a minor celebrity consultant in the early Hollywood film industry. Two separate Wyatt Earp revolvers have crossed major auction blocks in recent years. Back in 2014, a Colt 45 believed to have been on Earp's hip during the Tombstone shootout sold at J. Levine auction for $225,000, crushing its $150,000 estimate. Then in November of 2025, a fully documented Earp Colt single-action army sold at Pallane Antiques and Auctions for $195,200, complete with an archive that included a copy of Earp's obituary and notarized correspondence between his family and a close friend named James Mitchell. In 1990, a documented Earp Colt might have brought $45,000. Today, any verified example with a real paper trail is a $150,000 gun and climbing, and researchers still comb through Earp family estate records, hoping to surface another confirmed example. Moving on to number 7, Doc Holliday's Colt Lightning. John Henry Holliday trained as a dentist in Philadelphia before tuberculosis pushed him west chasing a drier climate. Instead, he found Dodge City, Tombstone, and Leadville, and became one of the most feared gunfighters the frontier ever produced, a man contemporaries described as quiet, well-educated, and utterly without fear once a confrontation started. He stood beside the Earps at the OK Corral before dying of his disease in November of 1887, reportedly looking down at his own bare feet in his final moments and remarking on the irony of dying in bed rather than with his boots on. Holliday's preferred sidearm was the Colt Model 1877, lightning-chambered in .38 long Colt, a double-action revolver that let him fire faster than a standard single-action army, and the lighter caliber was easier on lungs that were already failing him and a hand that reportedly shook from his illness. Back in 2005, an unauthenticated lightning tied loosely to Holliday brought $12,000. Today, examples with real documentation behind the Holliday name are bringing $85,000 to $250,000 depending on how strong the provenance is, and a fully verified personal sidearm would likely clear $500,000 at a major auction house, given how few Holliday relics have ever surfaced publicly. That kind of gun needs documentation through people close to him, his common-law wife Kate Elder, his cousin Robert Holliday, or period gambling hall records, along with a serial number that lines up with his active years out west between 1877 and 1887. Quick question before we keep going. Does your family have any old frontier-era Colt sitting in a closet or a safe? Something passed down from a great-grandfather who lived out west? Drop the region in the comments. I read every single one. Number 6, Jesse James's Colt and Smith and Wesson Schofield. Jesse James was born in Clay County, Missouri in 1847, and he rode with Confederate guerrillas under William Quantrill during the Civil War before turning that experience into 16 years of robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains across 4 states with his brother Frank, becoming perhaps the most mythologized outlaw in American history through decades of dime novels published while he was still alive. He was shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford in April of 1882 while straightening a picture frame on his own wall, a betrayal that Ford committed for a reward and a promised pardon. For everyday carry, James favored the Colt single-action army, but for robberies, he preferred the Smith & Wesson Schofield, a top-break revolver that let him eject and reload the entire cylinder in seconds, a real advantage when speed meant the difference between getting away clean or not getting away at all, particularly on horseback during a fast exit from a bank. Documented James firearms have brought serious money for decades. A Colt with provenance through his own son sold privately for over $200,000, and a documented Schofield has cleared $300,000. Fewer than 15 authentic examples are believed to remain in private hands anywhere in the world, and museums in Missouri actively compete with private collectors whenever one surfaces at auction. The chain of ownership has to run through his widow Zerelda, his son Jesse Jr., his brother Frank, or period photography, and in some cases forensic ballistic work has actually tied specific revolvers back to documented robberies committed by the James Younger gang. Number 5, Bat Masterson's Colt. William Barclay Masterson was born in Quebec in 1853 and was hunting buffalo on the southern plains by 19. By 23, he was sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, home to Dodge City, and along the way he fought at the Battle of Adobe Walls and served as a deputy under Wyatt Earp during the height of the Kansas Cattletown violence. He eventually left the frontier behind entirely and became a sports writer in New York City, covering boxing for decades and rubbing shoulders with the same Eastern high society that once only read about him in dime novels, before dying at his desk in 1921. Masterson carried several Colt single-action Army revolvers throughout his lawman years, favoring the 7.5-inch cavalry-length barrel, and he sold or gifted a number of them during his lifetime, which means several separate examples each carry their own documented history today, some traced through personal letters he wrote describing the exact guns he was parting with. One of his personal Colts sold at the Bonham's Early West auction in August of 2021 for over $375,000, part of the massive Jim and Teresa Earl collection that brought in more than $12 million across its full run of lots. In 1990, a Masterson Colt would have sold for under $50,000. Today, any example tied to a serious collection or museum provenance is bringing $300,000 to $600,000, and demand only grows every time a new Masterson biography or documentary reintroduces him to a wider audience. Coming in at position 4, Wild Bill Hickok's Springfield and Navy Colts. James Butler. Hickok was born in Illinois in 1837 and served as a Union scout during the Civil War, before working as a deputy U.S. Marshal, Sheriff of Hays City, and Marshal of Abilene, Kansas, building a reputation as perhaps the fastest and most accurate pistol shot on the entire frontier. He was shot dead in 1876 while playing poker in a Deadwood saloon, holding the hand of cards that history now calls the dead man's hand. Black aces over black eights, a hand so famous it has become permanent shorthand in American cardroom culture. Hickok's signature sidearms were a matched pair of Colt 1851 Navy revolvers, worn ivory handled with the butts forward for a cross-draw, and he was buried with both of them still on him, which is exactly why authentic Hickok Navy Colts almost never surface on the open market. His personal Springfield rifle, used during his scouting days, stayed in his family for more than 100 years before it sold at the same Bonham's Early West auction in August of 2021 for over $475,000. When an authentic Hickok Navy Colt does appear, and it's rare, they've crossed $200,000 to $400,000, with collectors treating any confirmed sighting as a career-defining acquisition. The documentation trail usually runs through people who actually knew him, like Buffalo Bill Cody, along with period photographs and family provenance through his sister Lydia. At 3, John Wesley Hardin's Colt. If Billy the Kid gets the headlines, John Wesley Hardin was actually the deadliest gunman the frontier ever produced. Born in Texas in 1853, he killed his first man at 15 and had at least 27 documented killings by the age of 21, though he claimed 42 in his own autobiography, a number historians still argue over today. He was captured in Florida in 1877 and spent 17 years in Huntsville prison, where he studied law and even wrote his own memoir behind bars. After his release in 1894, he actually became a practicing attorney in El Paso, Texas, a strange final chapter for a man once considered the most wanted killer in the state, before being shot dead in the Acme Saloon in 1895 while playing dice with his back turned. Hardin's personal Colt, tied to multiple documented gunfights during his outlaw years, sold at the Bonham's Early West auction in August of 2021 for over $625,000. The provenance ran through Texas Ranger evidence files, references in his own published memoir, and a family inheritance chain through his sister Maddie. Any Hardin firearm needs that kind of paper trail, Huntsville prison evidence records, period Ranger files, or autobiographical references, and a serial number that fits his active years as a Texas outlaw. Number 2, John Selman's Colt Single Action Army. John Selman is not a household name the way Hardin or Earp are, but his revolver tells one of the darkest stories on this entire list. Born in Arkansas in 1839, Selman fought for the Confederacy before becoming one of the most controversial peace officers in West Texas, a man contemporaries described as having spent as much time on the wrong side of the law as the right side of it before he ever pinned on a badge. He served as a deputy in El Paso, and on August 19, 1895, he walked into the Acme Saloon and shot John Wesley Hardin in the back of the head while Hardin played dice at the bar, a killing that ended the career of the most prolific gunman in Texas history in a single unseen moment. Selman himself was killed the following year by a U.S. Marshal in an alleyway gunfight, closing out a violent chapter in less than 12 months. The Colt Selman used to kill Hardin was authenticated through Texas court evidence, El Paso police reports, and a documented chain of ownership, and it sold at the Bonham's Early West auction in August of 2021 for $858,313. That kind of price only exists because the paper trail is airtight. Court records straight out of the El Paso District Court from the investigation into Hardin's death, and period photographs placing Selman with that exact weapon in 1895. Before we get to number one, imagine finding out that the old revolver your grandfather brought home decades ago and left in a closet is actually tied to one of these names. It happens more often than you'd think, and it's exactly why estate sales across this country are quietly costing families fortunes they never knew they had. At number one, Pat Garrett's Colt Single Action Army, the revolver that killed Billy the Kid, and the single most valuable firearm ever sold at public auction. William Henry McCarty Jr. was born in New York City in 1859 and raised in the New Mexico Territory, where he earned the name Billy the Kid during the Lincoln County War of 1878, a bloody range feud between competing merchant factions that turned a teenager into a killer. By 21, he had killed at least 8 documented men, and the territorial governor put a $500 bounty on his head, a reward that seems almost laughably small given what that same revolver would one day be worth. Sheriff Pat Garrett of Lincoln County took the job of hunting him down, tracking him for months across a stretch of New Mexico desert most lawmen had already given up on. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett ambushed the kid inside a darkened bedroom at Pete Maxwell's ranch in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The kid walked into that room not knowing Garrett was waiting, and Garrett shot him once in the chest. He was 21 years old, and his death instantly became one of the most retold moments in American frontier history. That revolver passed through a string of private collectors over the following 14 decades before ending up in the legendary Jim and Teresa Earl collection, assembled over 50 years by a Texas A&M engineering professor and his wife, who quietly built one of the finest private Americana collections in the country. After Jim Earl passed away in 2019, his family consigned the entire collection to Bonham's in Los Angeles. On August 27, 2021, Pat Garrett's Colt sold for $6,030,313, obliterating its $2 to $3 million pre-auction estimate after a bidding war nobody saw coming, a number that stunned even veteran auction house staff. The buyer has remained anonymous ever since. Bonham's called it the single most iconic object in early Western history, and the sale still stands as the world record for any firearm ever sold at public auction. The full Earl collection brought in over $12 million across 265 lots that day. The documentation behind Garrett's Colt includes a factory archive letter confirming its 1878 production date, chain of custody records from the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, and the full Earl collection provenance file. So if your family has an old frontier Colt with any documented tie to a lawman or an outlaw from that era, do not clean it, do not restore it, and do not let anyone talk you into touching the finish. Call a specialist Western Americana auction house before you do anything else. You could be sitting on the single most valuable category of firearm in private hands in America today. That's the list. Now I want to hear from you. Does your family have any documented frontier-era firearms passed down from someone who lived out west? Tell me the story in the comments. I read every single one. If this list taught you something, hit subscribe. Next week, I'm breaking down the rare Wild West guns that have quietly sold for millions without most people ever hearing about it. And you do not want to miss it.